This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. A month ago, horticulturist Charlie Nardozzi joined us on Where We Live to answer all of your gardening questions, and we had a great response and a great time. So we're back with another hour on Connecticut gardening. But today, we're actually going to be exploring some of the state's most remarkable gardens. Later, we hear about Connecticut Historic Gardens Day and what it takes to become a master gardener. But first up, Karen B. Davis is an architectural and landscape design photographer, and she's also the author of a new book called Connecticut Gardens, a celebration of the state's historic, public, and private gardens. And we're also joined by Chris Lawrie, who is the co-author of the new book. Thank you both so much for joining us this morning.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you, Catherine.
And just a reminder for our listeners that you can also join the conversation. Let us know if you have a favorite garden here in Connecticut, 888-720-9677. That's 888-720-WNPR, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. Chris, you started the book by talking about the origins of the gardens. You know, gardens have become or have been a part of human history for many, many generations. So what do we know about what gardens have looked like throughout the ages, and how have they evolved?
Well, that's a great question, Catherine. Originally, gardens began as basically for survival. As we moved away from our sort of nomadic hunter civilization into a more centralized living, we had gardens, and that's really what was able to get that whole shift in the way we lived started. So they started out as survival, mostly for food that was gathered and planted from seeds gathered from nature. And then little by little, we added other things. We grew our medicine in our gardens. Eventually, we would grow plants that were good for making dyes or for weaving. And then as we became more stable, we started to grow gardens for beauty. And when the settlers came to the United States, the first thing they did was grow gardens for survival. But then eventually they added just plants that just were nostalgic and brought them back to their homelands. And beauty became a feature of the garden. Over time, gardens, the reason for gardening has changed quite a bit. I mean, their gardens are created for status. Sometimes they're created for legacy, but I say mostly gardens are created for joy. And maybe now also gardens are created for sanity, because we really can't control all the events in the world, but we can find joy in our gardens, and it is something that we can control.
And Karen, with Chris just mentioning how it seems like there's a lot of cultural roots to the reasons why people garden and bringing their culture from wherever they're from. And for such a small state, your book shows that we have so many beautiful gardens right here at home. How did you go about choosing those gardens? What was your philosophy behind that?
Well, it started when I was photographing a private garden for a magazine, and I thought, wow, this would be great if people could see this garden and others that they don't get to see. And this is my third book, but I always wanted my books to be sort of like travel guides. So people who don't have a private garden or access to that world can actually open the book, look in the index, and visit the places. So that started me thinking about public gardens and historic gardens. I love history, so I always like to include anything historic when I can. And, the Connecticut Historic Gardens Association, which was established in 2004, they have 15 gardens. They did at the time when I started the book. Now they have 16 because they added the Mark Twain House. So that gave me 15 gardens immediately to cover. And I did a lot of research into public gardens. And there were a lot of public parks, but my cutoff sort of was, my criteria was that there had to be a dedicated garden within the public park to be included in the book, because it wasn't a book about parks, it was a book about gardens. And I also contacted a lot of garden associations and clubs to find out what private gardens might be out there and some of the public ones as well.
Well, I love flipping through it because I mean your photos are just gorgeous, and it makes me want to jump into it. And then I realize these are real gardens that I can go to. So
Right.
thanks for the reminder. And then I want to ask both of you: did either of you have a connection to gardening before writing this book? You know, Karen, let's start with you.
Well, by profession, I am a landscape design photographer, so I have photographed gardens. This was the most I have photographed in one go, let's say, because it was all done in one season. So that was my connection. But I love nature and I love gardens. And whenever I travel, those are the areas I gravitate to.
And Chris, what about you? Did you have a connection to gardening before being involved with this book?
Yes. I've spent about 40 years in the green industry. So I'm a landscape designer, and I had been a landscape contractor for about 30 years. But now I really, and I have to say, my gardening connection started when I was very young in my grandmother's garden, and I've always had this affinity for nature. And so, yeah, I have a deep love of gardens.
And just to let our listeners know that you can find a link to the book on our website, ctpublic.org/where we live. And Chris, I want to talk with you real quickly too. You know, with Connecticut's climate shifting and also being in two different zones, what does that mean about the type of gardens that we see here in Connecticut and also the biodiversity in those gardens?
Well, it means a lot. We have tremendous biodiversity in Connecticut, and we're seeing it change. I mean, you think of trees like as being stationary, but actually our sugar maples are migrating northward. So that sounds odd. How could they migrate? But what we're seeing is that there's fewer and fewer sugar maples in the south. And as we go north, we're northern ranges of New England, where you perhaps wouldn't have found a sugar maple. Now they're beginning to grow there. So the plants are very adaptable, and they move slowly, but they do move and they do change. But it's certainly something to consider. I just designed a garden where the client really wanted to have crepe myrtle, and crepe myrtle is considered a southern plant. And 10 years ago, I wouldn't have endorsed that idea, but now I think, plants from the south that we couldn't plant, a few decades ago now can grow here. And then there's going to be plants that we have that eventually won't grow well here. So it's a shift. And I think it's going to be time soon to reassess what zone we are in. So it's just something we're all going to have to deal with.
And Chris, the book is divided in three parts, and we're going to start by talking about the Connecticut Historic Gardens section. You started with this group of gardens. What makes these gardens so special? And we were just talking about biodiversity. Do these gardens play a huge role in keeping that?
They do. Well, they show the historic gardens are fascinating. They're many of them are less gardens. It's more of a historical investigation when you go to a historic garden, because you're going to have complete exposure to the way people lived in a time period. There are some historic gardens where the plants have actually changed because the certain species are no longer readily available, but generally historians and the people who manage those gardens have a keen eye on trying to maintain history correctly. And so they do their best to plant what was there when those gardens were used.
I actually had the pleasure of visiting a Tudor house in Southampton, England, a couple years ago, and just by you describing, I remember visiting the house that has a small garden, and they planted the floral and the fauna that was supposed to be there during that time. And I learned so much from that, and it just kind of humanized history as well. And so, Chris, in the book, you also captured some of the stories around these historic gardens. Why was that important to you? Not just to capture what the garden literally looks like, but also to talk about the deep history behind it.
Well, Karen came up with this brilliant idea of showcasing the historic gardens and the public gardens, the private gardens, and her photographs. A photograph is worth 1,000 words. So they sort of tell the story of the garden. So I didn't just want to sort of regurgitate these plants are in this section and these plants are there. I wanted to tell the stories of the people behind the gardens and try to offer the reader something that they wouldn't necessarily find even by visiting the garden. So, I think gardens are part of a human story, and so that's what I was trying to bring to Karen's images was the human story behind those gardens.
And what were some of your favorites, Chris?
The historic gardens?
Yeah. Top three, maybe.
You know, well, I know you're having Sandy on. She's going to talk about the historic gardens, and I think she's the manager at Promisec. That is I love the story of Promisec, the history of how it evolved. I think Florence Griswold is another great story of how Florence Griswold, it's a rag to riches story, how, she started out just trying to survive, and she ended up helping to create the Lyme colony of impressionistic artists. So they all have merit in all their different ways. And that's one of the things about this book. I mean, I'll just say, as a garden person, I felt like I knew gardens, but there's so many things that I learned from working on this book, gardens that I had never heard of or seen. And it just, reinforces that Connecticut is a garden state.
And a lot of the stories that came out, which were interesting to me, were about women and women's firsts, like Beatrix Farron, who designed Promisec, and also the Hillstead Garden at Hillstead Museum. She was the country's first female landscape architect. And then Theodate Pope, who designed the house at the Hillstead Museum, was one of the country's first female architects. And then we have the Osborne Kellogg Museum, which was inherited by Frances Osborne, and she took over her father's dairy farm and brass manufacturing business, much to, the chagrin of the shareholders, but really increased that wealth and went on to donate the property to the state and establish a educational nature facility there as well.
And Karen, I love that you mentioned that because, we were just talking to Chris about why was it important to sort of capture the history behind these gardens. And I want to ask you, Karen, was it special to discover these stories, especially these gardens that were started and designed by women? Was it important for you to sort of showcase those stories for many of us who may not know that these amazing women started and designed these gardens?
I definitely think it's important, especially in the times we're living in, where these stories they're not always at the forefront, but they deserve to be. And there's so many women, even if you go further into it and look at all the women in Connecticut that have had a significant place in our history, I think it's very important to get these stories out there. And it's wonderful that they were able to come through in the gardens. And it was a surprise to me. I didn't really, working with a writer and just doing the photography, I didn't really know. I knew some of it, but I didn't know as much as Chris uncovered.
And was it groundbreaking that so many of these gardens were established by women?
I don't know if they, since there's 15 and they all were not, but I think about half of them were actually, so I guess that is pretty groundbreaking, or they had a lot of involvement.
So I would just add that it is quite a feat, but it's also, you know, kind of a reflection of women's roles in the household. If we go beyond the designs of Beatrix Farrand, um, then we see that like the in the historic gardens, uh, Stanley Whitman and other gardens, it was the women who were the providers for the family. And so they were sort of forced into that, but that is part of the evolution. That's part of the history. And that's a very fascinating feature. But gardening is, I feel like the best garden designers today even are really women. So I'm a big fan of this whole women in the garden.
Well, and we're going back in time and in history, and also talking about the evolution of these gardens. So, Chris, can you talk about why historic houses are also now choosing to preserve the gardens and even trying to use the plants and flowers that might have originally been used when the gardens were first designed?
Well, I think it's a a clever mission to have to include both the garden and the history into preservation, because you have people who are going to be attracted by the history, and you're going to have people who are attracted by the gardens, and you bring that together, and it's sort of like you can use Karen's book as a travel guide. You can visit these historic gardens, and it will allow you to have times. It's like we go to a museum, say a great museums, maybe we pick a rainy day. If we go to these museums, let's pick a sunny day, because we get to walk through the gardens, and then we get to spend time in the museum and learn about the way people lived during that time period. And Connecticut's got a whole range from gardens that date back to the late 1600s, the historic gardens, all the way into the late 1800s. So you really can get a lot out of visiting these places.
And you've also spent a lot of time in the book examining our state's public garden, but the idea of public gardens and spaces weren't always a given. So, in fact, they're actually pretty revolutionary. Can you talk to us about what you learned about that?
The Connecticut's public gardens and public gardens throughout America and even other countries, it really started in England, and it's really sort of an offshoot of the industrial period, where people started, we left our farms and we're working in cities and dark, sort of toxic environments in factories. And then those same people would leave, the workers, and they would go back to their row houses. And there was a movement in the mid 1800s to start to, it was a sort of start to humanize and treat people more fairly. So it was a noble cause that was taken up by religious figures and public figures, and so that was the beginning of the American urban parks and recreation movement. And actually, the first public park in America is Bushnell Park in Hartford.
Oh, that's an amazing fact. And Karen, I want to jump to you to talk about private gardens. How accessible are these to the public?
Well, there's quite a few in the book that actually are open to the public, and the owners have open garden days. And if you go to their website, you can find their hours. And also, the Garden Conservancy lists some of those properties, and through the Garden Conservancy, they partnered with them to have open garden days. So there is access.
And Chris, I know you talked about this a little bit earlier, and we only have about a minute left, but I want to ask still that gardens used to be used for more practical reasons, for survival and to provide. So, from where you're standing, why do you think we create gardens today?
I think today, we have the luxury of creating gardens mostly for joy. And I think that's why we do it. I mean, there's just, and I mentioned earlier that maybe it's a way to have control over something that we can't control. So I think that's the reason. I think, but it's a very complex. Nature's very simple in how it creates its own gardens and landscapes, but our we really have myriad motivations for having gardens and creating gardens.
And Karen, just really quickly too, I want to ask, why do you think we create gardens today?
I think it's for pure beauty, and that's why I love to photograph them.
Well, thank you so much for sharing. You've been listening to Karen B. Davis. She's the author of Connecticut Gardens, a celebration of the state's historic, public, and private gardens, as well as Chris Lawrie, who co-authored the book. Thank you both so much for sharing your experiences with us this morning.
Thank you for having us.
You can find a link to the book and see some of the beautiful pictures from the book on our website, ctpublic.org/wherewelive. Coming up next, we'll talk with curators and gardeners at the Mark Twain House and the nonprofit Connecticut Historic Gardens about how history makes an impact on their gardening philosophies. You can join the conversation, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. We've been talking about all things floral and fauna when it comes to historic gardens here in Connecticut. Gardening is such a huge part of human history. For some, it was a way to survive, while for others, it was created for beauty and joy. Here to talk more about how a garden gets a historic label is Jody DeBrine. She's the Beatrice Fox Auerbach Director of Collections at the Mark Twain House, and Jill Hogan, who's the president of Promisec at Three Rivers Farm, which is a Catholic educational and environmental organization, and she's also the president of the Connecticut Historic Gardens. Thank you both so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
And for our listeners, you can also join the conversation. Give us a call, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. So, Jody, we heard a bit about the historic gardens from Karen Davis and Chris Lawrie, who are authors of Connecticut Gardens. I want to ask you, what is the criteria of becoming a historic garden?
I think Jill might be able to answer that better than I am, since the Mark Twain House is the newest member of the historic Connecticut Historic Gardens. But for us, it was, being able to plant both inside and in our conservatory and outside in our gardens, plants that were historically accurate to the Clemens's era, as well as in patterns and motifs and just the way that the gardens look. To capture the history of the era that we celebrate.
Well, Joe, I wanted to ask you the question anyway, so can you answer?
Sure.
From where you're standing.
The primary criteria is that the site must have a garden that is historically significant and has to have been designed by a known designer or reflect a historical garden style or design philosophy, and that it really should be in collaboration with a historic house or something that is accessible to the public. So the criteria is really a garden that is tied to a house that has to be available to the public and has some historic significance in the state of Connecticut.
So it sounds like a devotion and love of gardens to be able to have that label.
Yes, I think it's not only a devotion and a love of gardens, but also to the history of the gardens and how the intersection between the garden and the house is important to the telling the story, as Chris talked about earlier, telling the story of what happened, of the designer, of the relationship. So some of the gardens are purely for beauty, and some of the historic gardens were gardens that had a very functional purpose for example, the Stanley Whitman house, it's an herb garden. It's in relationship to the house, and it reflects a time period, a colonial time period, where the garden was provided food and vegetables for that house and medicine. So each garden is different in that way, that it's distinctly representing the history of the time period.
Well, I'm glad that you mentioned history, because I want to ask Jody, can you tell us about some of the history of the Mark Twain House Gardens and how you worked to restore it?
Absolutely. So the house itself was built in 1874, and it went through, the Clemenses lived there for 17 years, and then the Bissells lived there, and then the Kingswood School was there, and then it was apartments. And, so it's had this long history of multiple uses. So when it became a museum, we did a lot of efforts to restore the historic house to its grandeur of the 1880s when the Clemenses lived there. And then our focus turned to the outside. I think one of the things that Jill and Chris and everybody has talked about is that, the history and the beauty extends beyond the physical walls of the house into the gardens and into the landscaping. So about 15 years ago, the Mark Twain House and a group of volunteer master gardeners got together and really started digging into the history of this place, looking at photographs, looking at letters of the Clemens family, of their friends, of their neighbors, of their reporters that came here, and really trying to piece together what plants were where and how this landscape really defined the Nook Farm neighborhood that the Clemenses lived in, that Harry Beecher Stowe lived in. They're right across the lawn, and they have beautiful historic gardens as well. So you kind of get a 2-for-1 when you visit us. And with that, we were able to identify both locations in which gardens or trees or other plantings were located, as well as some of the plants that we know that they preferred, both in the conservatory and outside. So with that, we were able to recreate and really grow and reestablish these gardens across our campus. If we didn't know exactly what plants were in there, we used other resources like a book called Practical Floriculture that was given from Olivia Clemens to their first gardener, Daniel Malloy. And he has notes and scribbles and things in there that we were able to recreate plants from there, or pick plants based on his notes. And then, just based on Victorian designs of the era and research into that, we were able to kind of reestablish our gardens and make them a lovely place to visit.
Well, I'm having a little nerd moment here because I love the fact that you learn about what the plants and flowers were used to from letters and notes and whatnot. So I always feel a little weird, like, am I being creepy if I'm reading someone else's letters? But hey, you're doing it for a good cause. I want to talk more about using the plants and flowers that were originally used when the gardens were first designed. So can you walk us through a little bit more about, what did you learn from the letters and the notes that you were able to study, and were you able to sort of find the plants and flowers that were originally there?
Yeah, I mean, we have based on the letters and things that we've been able to find, we have a list of plants that we know that the Clemenses grew, and then we have a list of plants that are common to the era. One of the in my opinion, like the coolest thing, other than that book that I just mentioned, is that the Clemenses' second gardener, John O'Neill, he cared for plants not only in the ground, in the gardens, in the conservatory, but there was also a greenhouse on the property between us and the Harriet Beecher Stowe house. And we know that Livy Clemens loved roses, and John in turn then became known in the Hartford community for his roses. So there are numerous newspaper articles out there mentioning John O'Neill and his primroses or lilies or other flowers that he became known for within the garden community. He would sell them on the side, or in the Hartford community, and he'd sell them on the side. And it's just this really cool piece of history. We are the Mark Twain house. We love the Clemens family. But through the gardens and the grounds and the plants, we've really gotten to know the people who worked here and interacted with the gardeners, which is a whole other story, just as important and just as fascinating.
I think, sorry, Jody.
Yeah,
I think that's something that's unique about the Connecticut Historic Gardens, because each of the gardens has a story behind the garden. And many gardens have done that kind of investigative research to either find the plans, find the original gardens, find the original plants. There's a story, for example, Bellamy Faraday House, Caroline Faraday helped survivors of Nazi concentration camps and hosted them in her house. And so there's this whole other human side of the gardens that relate to a history that is very fascinating. So it's that intersection between the garden and the history that I think is unique to the Connecticut's historic gardens as a whole.
Well, and I feel like just based on this conversation, I'm digging myself a hole here, pun 100% intended, of seeing gardens and gardening as a different kind of storytelling. And like both of you mentioned it, and Chris also mentioned this earlier, it's such a humanizing way of storytelling and learning about our past and history that I find really fascinating. And now my curiosity is even more piqued after this. But Jody, I want to ask you too, you mentioned earlier that this project also started 15 years ago. So can you tell us about how it got started? And I mean, lots of love and devotion to this to want to do that, right?
Oh, absolutely. I cannot emphasize enough the amount of work and dedication and love, as you say, that went into and still continues to go into our gardens. About 15 years ago, 2007, the museum center next to the house had been built, and we were really looking towards the landscaping plan. And a team of master gardeners really dedicated multiple years to this research and multiple years to reestablishing the gardens, getting the soil in, getting the plants from seedlings or babies to fully mature plants, and really tending to it and loving it. Right now, we have a group of about 7 volunteers who work on the outside and 3 who work in the conservatory. Most of them are master gardeners, and they are literally here multiple times a week, really giving their all to the landscape around our house, and it's so much appreciated. And as somebody who can't keep her houseplants alive, I so appreciate all of their knowledge and their respect for these plants and the history of them, to not only create beautiful places for our visitors to come and see, but also respect for the history. We have a pollination garden, which I know a lot of the historic gardens have. So we're really trying to respect history while also thinking about the future and keeping bees and birds and the whole pollination, butterflies, all of them alive in this ecosystem that's changing. And it's really spectacular what the gardeners at our site and at all of the historic and garden sites, what they've been able to accomplish.
Well, I just want to tell you, you don't know how happy it made me to hear you say that you're not able to keep houseplants alive, because I'm kind of on the same boat. I just bought 2 new houseplants. I'm not sure if I'm just kidding myself here, but I just wanted to make a note on that real quick. And also we're also going to be talking to master gardeners after this. But first, I want to ask Jill. This is also the first year that the Mark Twain House is going to be part of the Connecticut Historic Gardens Day. Can you tell us about this event and why is it such a big deal?
So Connecticut's Historic Gardens Day is a day where all 16 gardens are open from 12 to 4 p.m. It is June 25th this year. It's always the 4th Sunday of June. And it's a way to celebrate all of Connecticut's historic gardens, all of our member sites. All of the gardens are open free of charge. The houses associated with them would have their own admissions charge. So you should check their websites or Connecticut's Historic Gardens website for that information. But each site usually does something special to highlight their garden. Either some have programs for children. Promisec, for example, will have musicians on the terrace. Some have lectures. I think in general, the volunteers or master gardeners will be available for tours at each site. So this is a chance just for people to come out, celebrate Connecticut's historic gardens all on the same day. Each site is still open throughout the season at different times. So you should check individual sites, but this is one day where all the gardens are coming together to celebrate Connecticut's historic gardens. And we've been doing this for the past 19 years. So it's exciting.
And Jody, I want to ask you the same question too. This is the first time that Mark Twain House is going to be a part of it. How does it feel to be doing that? And why is it important to be a part of this?
Yeah, it's so exciting for us. We are so honored and proud to have been accepted into this group. Again, we've been working for over a decade on bringing our gardens to life. And within the last couple of years, we've really just been so proud of what we've accomplished, and being accepted into this group just, I don't know, celebrates and solidifies all that hard work. And for Historic Gardens Day on the 25th, it's really a chance for us to highlight the gardens to our visitors in a very deliberate way. People comment on a daily basis about them, but this is a chance for our gardeners to really interact with guests. We're going to have our living history actor who plays Patrick McAleer, who is the family's coachman. He's going to be on site to interact with guests. We always have scavenger hunts available to let people learn about the plants. Throughout the year, we've also done other things with like the language of flowers and things like that to highlight the different plants in our garden. So Connecticut Historic Gardens Day is just a culmination of all of those things that we're very excited to be a part of.
And we have a couple of minutes left, but I do want to ask both of you, throughout this conversation, we've been talking about the purpose gardens have served then and now, some for survival, some for pleasure. So I have to ask you now too, why gardens? Why is the act of tending and creating a garden still so important? Jill, let's start with you.
I think it's really this interaction between the individual and the land itself. I think the land can teach us something about ourselves, about our history, about what's important. I know just for myself and my own personal garden, for example, we had a rose bush that we transplanted and it looked like it was going to die. And a few weeks ago, this rose just popped out. And it was just, as I was driving in and I saw this rose, I was like, oh my gosh. And to me, analogously, it provides hope. Like, oh, you think something's dead and look, there's new life in a totally different way. So I think the importance of gardens, and particularly historic gardens, it shows the humanizing side, as Chris spoke about our history and what does that mean for our future. So,
well, I wish my houseplants did that. That's very helpful. Thank you very much.
They don't usually, yeah.
Jody, what about yourself? Why do you think gardens are so important today?
I agree with everything that everybody said. It's so profound in spring when the gardens come back to life and new buds start to bloom, and just the transformation of the exterior space outside it's just lovely. And to see how the garden changes throughout the seasons and the different plants that bloom, and just, I don't know, it's just, I'm always in awe of nature, and to have that little bit of nature here next to these very heavy brick structures is just, the juxtaposition is just gorgeous. We know that fruits and vegetables and things like that were planted in greenhouses and on site. But I think the beauty of it, as Chris and Caroline mentioned, the beauty and the joy that these plants bring is so important. And for us, the conservatory inside is just as important, because during the Victorian era, they really were proponents of having plants inside, which I think is a new movement, or not a new movement, but a vitalization of that movement as we all buy our own houseplants and try to keep them alive.
Well, that's to us to help keep them alive. Thank you both for sharing with us. You've been hearing from Jody DeBrine. She's the Beatrice Fox Auerbach Director of Collections at the Mark Twain House, and Jill Hogan. She's the president of Connecticut Historic Gardens. Thank you both so much for sharing your stories with us today.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
The term Master Gardener has been mentioned a few times during our conversation, but what exactly is a Master Gardener? Stay with us to find out when we chat with the coordinator with the University of Connecticut's Extension Master Gardener program. You can also join the conversation, 888-720-9677, or leave us a comment on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. What does it take to be a master gardener? Before we get that answer, I think the real question is, what is a master gardener? Here to teach us the ways is Sandy Wilson. She's a Fairfield County Master Gardener Coordinator for the University of Connecticut's Extension Master Gardener program. Thank you so much, Sandy, for joining us today.
Thank you for having me today, Catherine.
You can also join the conversation, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. And speaking of Twitter, we have Linda, who tweeted, as a volunteer guide at one of New York's beautiful botanical gardens and Connecticut resident, I am loving this program. Well, thank you so much, Linda, for that comment. We're loving this conversation as well. And back to Sandy, Jody mentioned earlier that it was the master gardeners that help restore the Mark Twain House gardens. And we've been talking about that. Many of us have heard the term, but may not be familiar with what it is, even though it might be a little self-explanatory. But tell us, what is a master gardener?
Well, a master gardener is someone who's gone through the University of Connecticut's Master Gardener program. It's a cooperative extension program that lasts about 9 months. And it's very rigorous, comprehensive. We have over 100 hours of training, of classroom and online training that people take. We go over all different facets of horticulture. We start off with botany and soils. We get into integrated pest management, all the different crops such as turf grass and fruits, vegetables. So you get an overall rigorous program teaching you all about horticulture. And we also get into diagnostics. So you learn all about how to identify plant problems, how to identify plants in general. We have a project that they actually have to complete. And we teach them how to identify invasive plants and native plants and trees and shrubs. So it's a really comprehensive program. And it also includes an internship, a 60-hour internship. And half of that is in an extension office across the state, where you actually learn how to diagnose plant problems, and people come in and bring problems. They bring in different samples and we have to identify them. And then also they do 30 hours of volunteer time in the community. And that's what, a lot of the different projects, one of them are these historic gardens. We have master gardeners that have been involved with these historic gardens across the state. I know you were talking about the Mark Twain House, and master gardeners have been involved with that for many years, but also Promisec Garden in Bridgewater and Elizabeth Park in Hartford, that beautiful garden with all the roses and lovely gardens. Master gardeners help out there. They volunteer at Harkness Memorial State Park, which is a Beatrice Ferran garden as well. So, it's a pretty comprehensive program, and you learn a lot. You meet some wonderful people that all have the same mentality. They love nature, they love gardening, they want to share their knowledge. And that's part of the requirements. You need to be able to want to volunteer, better your community, and share your gardening knowledge with others.
Well, it sounds like an amazing program to be a part of. And I'm not going to lie, I kind of picture Master Gardeners in cloaks and just kind of go through the gardens mysteriously, because to me, a lot of plants are mysterious. So that's just me in my mind. But I also want to talk about, you mentioned that they go through a lot of sort of elements as a part of this program. And it seems like a big part of becoming a Master Gardener is also having a connection to the public and furthering education about gardening. Can you talk about that component a bit?
Sure. As I said, one of the things we do is in the extension offices, where there are 8 Yukon cooperative extension offices across the state. We answer gardening questions during the gardening season. So it's a free service, and people can come into their local extension office and bring plants and insects they want identified. And Master Gardeners that have gone through the program actually mentor the new interns in the program. So they learn how to go about doing all that. So as for instance, yesterday, we had a number of people from the public that came into the Bethel Extension office that brought in different plant material that they wanted identified. There was a woman that wasn't sure what was going wrong with her Ilex glabra, her inkberry holly, and we had someone else that came in with a plant that had azalea leaf gall on it. So we do all that. It's a free service. And I think a lot of times people aren't aware that we're out there to answer gardening questions, but that's a key component of what a Master Gardener does.
And we got about 2 minutes left here, but I want to ask Sandy that tell us more about the work that you do with the Historic Garden, and are there components that you would like our listeners to know more about?
So they also volunteer with the Historic Gardens, doing research, investigative research on some of those plans for the original gardens, actually installing and maintaining some of these historic gardens. So they're involved in a lot of aspects of it. Sometimes they're even docents in some of these gardens. There's a lovely garden, Gertrude Jekyll Garden in Woodbury, connected with the Glebe House that they're involved in, and lots of other ones, and also even just local historical societies that we help out with. But that's not only the only outreach that we do. We actually are involved in a lot of giving gardens where we grow food for the hungry and donate all the proceeds of the harvest to different food pantries. So that's another aspect of some of the wonderful projects that the Master Gardeners are involved with.
Well, thank you so much for sharing. I think I've learned so much just from this conversation. You've been listening to Sandy Wilson. She's the Fairfield County Master Gardener Coordinator for the University of Connecticut's Extension Master Gardener Program. Thank you so much, Sandy, for spending time with us today.
Thank you. Great program. Appreciate it.
I'm Catherine Shen. Today's show is produced by Tess Terrible. Our technical producer is Kat Pastor. Download Where We Live anytime on your favorite podcast app. And thank you so much for listening.